Welcome to the Harvard Business School video series. In this program, Professor David Garvin of the Harvard Business School moves beyond statistical quality control and quality assurance to strategic quality management, a new approach designed to maximize the power of quality as a competitive weapon. A McKinsey Award-winning contributor to the Harvard Business Review and the author of Managing Quality, Garvin is acknowledged as a leading authority in the quality field. Segment 1, Strategic Quality Management.
Hi, I'm Dave Garvin, and I'd like to welcome you to this show on strategic quality management. What we're going to be talking about is a different approach to quality, one that stands in sharp distinction to the approach that companies in this country have practiced historically. We've designed this video with several purposes, several benefits in mind for you. The first is for you to understand clearly exactly what distinguishes the competitive approach to quality, what it means to use quality as a basis for competition rather than a simple defensive tool. Second, it's enable you to understand exactly where you are today in a continuum of quality management. How far are you from that desired endpoint, and what's it going to take to get you there? And third, it's designed to provide you with a variety of pieces of advice and a variety of tools, both for different organizational departments, R&D, design, manufacturing, marketing, operations, sales, and also for different levels in the organization, starting at the very top with the chief executive or chief operating officer, moving down to mid-level managers, and in particular quality professionals, and then down to the shop floor or operating level, the men and women who on a day-to-day basis have to execute the plans that have come down to them. To begin, what I'd like to do is give you some perspective. I'd like to begin with a quote from a 1983 White House conference on quality and productivity that very much sets the stage for what we're going to be talking about. This quote very clearly sets up the difference between a strategic approach to quality and what came earlier. The quote begins by saying, "Managing the quality dimension of an organization is not generically different from any other aspect of management. It involves the formulation of strategies, setting goals and objectives, developing action plans, implementing plans, and using control systems for monitoring feedback and taking corrective action." And now here's the really important sentence. If quality is viewed only as a control system, it will never be substantially improved. Quality is not just a control system. Quality is a management function. That's really the important message. We're no longer talking about quality control, about prevention, but about quality as a strategic and competitive weapon. To understand that a little bit better, I have to take you on a whirlwind tour of the quality movement in this country. Now, please bear with me for a little bit because much of this will be old hat. But the point that we're getting at is, if you can understand past history, you can also understand just how different the strategic approach is from what came before it. So what does the history of the quality movement in this country look like? There are four distinct eras. The first is inspection, which is the way the quality movement stood pretty much from the 1800s through the early 1900s. During this period, all that quality professionals did was sort good product from bad. People stood at the end of the line using various tools like gauges and took measurements. If a product was good, it continued on in the production process. If the product was bad, it got thrown out or reworked. All you saw during this period was quality was a problem to be solved, and the focus was on defects. The next era in quality is quality control, and that's associated with the rise of a variety of statistical and mathematical techniques, such things as process control charts and sampling measures. All these things do is use a small sample of products, 5 perhaps out of 100 that are produced, and on that basis try to determine whether the entire production lot or the entire lot of incoming product is good or bad. What you see happening here is that quality is still a problem to be solved, but now what we're using is much more efficient techniques for doing the sorting of the good from the bad. Quality professionals engage now in troubleshooting. They have more sophisticated tools at their disposal, but they're still involved in an activity that seeks to reduce problems rather than pursuing quality as any sort of an opportunity. The final era in the quality movement is quality assurance, and that's got several discrete parts. One is a new measurement, the costs of quality, which were first proposed by Joseph Juran. The idea here is that quality has benefits on the cost side. The reason is that preventing problems is almost always cheaper than detecting them after the fact. And in fact, Juran called this gold in the mine. Quality assurance also includes total quality control, the involvement of all functions, not simply manufacturing or operations, in ensuring that quality improvement goals were met. Total quality begins with the conception of the product. The various earliest stages in marketing and market research continues through product design and development, through manufacturing, and eventually to customer service. All groups have to work together to ensure that a quality product comes out. Within quality assurance, you also have the rise of reliability engineering. Again, statistical tools are involved. Here the purpose is to design in or build in quality in sophisticated electronic systems. These tend to be made up of a variety of components. You check each of the components, see how they might fail over time, build up the design of the overall system, then see what you can do in terms of using components at lower than desired stress levels, building in redundancies, to make sure that the overall system is more reliable. And finally, the last piece of quality assurance is zero defects. This arose back in the early 1960s at the Martin Company. Martin was building missiles for the U.S. Army Missile Command. Initially, they had some success in inspecting in quality. They then found that because of production pressures and a time bind, they didn't have the time to inspect in quality for the first field Pershing missile. What did they do? They went to the workforce and requested, really set a new standard, saying, could you please avoid making mistakes? After 2 months of feverish activity, they ended up delivering a perfect missile. And they found the reason for doing that was that they had finally caught the workers' interest and attention. They involved different levels of the organization as well as different functions. Now that's a whirlwind history. We move from inspection to quality control to quality assurance. What you see is a very clear evolution from an initial focus on detecting problems to controlling them and then focusing on coordination. What's equally important is what you don't see. The focus is not on strategic impact. Similarly, the view of quality here is very much a problem to be solved. Whether we're solving that problem through inspection, through setting up elaborate control charts, or through various coordinated activities where we're now attacking the problem proactively, quality is still a problem to be solved. In the new era, the strategic era that we'll be talking about, quality is a competitive opportunity. Again, if we go back to those earlier eras, we see that the focus is largely internal. In some cases, we're talking about manufacturing or operating departments. In some cases, we're talking about design and development groups. In the new era, the strategic era, the focus is front and center on the market and on customer needs. What about the role of quality professionals? We've seen that role evolve over time, from people who simply sorted good product from bad, to people who had mathematical tools at their disposal, to people who worked as coordinators. What we didn't see, and what we will be seeing in the strategic era, is their involvement in the strategic planning process. The fact that quality becomes a business objective of equal standing with marketing and financial goals. And finally, if we go through those early eras, we see the involvement of multiple departments and eventually the involvement of different levels in the organization. But there's one piece that's missing, and that's the leadership of senior management. In the strategic era, the architects of change, the people who drive the process forward, are the very senior managers in the company, the CEOs and COOs who set the strategic objectives and decide how a company is going to compete. So what you're really seeing is an evolution from inspecting inequality to controlling inequality to building inequality and ultimately, in this final era, the one that we're going to be focusing on, an emphasis on managing in quality. Before we go on, there's one final point that needs to be made. And that goes back to the distinction between the first three eras and the fourth, strategic quality management, which we're going to be focusing on. And that is that many companies today think they're practicing a strategic approach, think they're using quality as a competitive weapon, think they're focused on the market and customer needs, when in fact they're still mired in the earlier eras of either inspection, quality control, or quality assurance. There are significant differences between this new approach and past practice. In a similar fashion, many of the quality programs that are now being offered today have clear roots in those earlier eras, largely in quality control and quality assurance. Many of them don't take that final step of giving you a strategic and competitive orientation. That's what we'll be focusing on in the remainder of this show. In the next segment, we'll turn to the first two defining characteristics of the strategic approach to quality. First, the fact that quality is defined from the customer's point of view, and second, the fact that quality is linked with profitability on both the market and the cost sides.
Segment 2, Quality and the Customer.
Let's begin with the first element, or the first defining characteristic of the strategic approach to quality. And that is that quality is defined from the customer's point of view. Here, the principle is very simple. Quality is not what the marketing department says it is. It's not what the engineering or design group says it is. It's not what the manufacturing people says it is. It's what the customer says it is. And very clearly, this requires some sophisticated market research on quality. Think back for a minute to the earlier eras, inspection, quality control, and quality assurance. You didn't see the customer. The customer was hidden somehow because all we were talking about in those days was quality as a problem to be solved. Here's one of the most pronounced shifts when we move to the strategic era. The customer becomes front and center. He or she is the one that defines the product or service and tells us what good quality actually is. Now, if we want to define quality from the customer's point of view, be it the internal or the external customer, we have to have a more precise vocabulary, a better way of narrowing down exactly what it is the customer means when he or she says this is a high-quality product or a high-quality service. To do that, we're going to disaggregate the concept of quality, take it apart, put it into its constituent pieces, smaller, narrower pieces that allow us to talk more precisely about what exactly is quality, what does it mean, and how can we position ourselves as a company on the various aspects, or what we'll call the dimensions of quality. In total, there are 8 dimensions of quality. The first is performance. Performance is the primary operating characteristics of a product or service. It's why you buy that product or buy that service in the first place. For an automobile, it would be how quickly does it go from 0 to 60 miles an hour. For a color television, it would be how well does it pull in distant stations. For a fancy French restaurant, it would be how good is the food. The basic reason for purchasing a product or service in the first place. The second dimension of quality is features. Features are bells and whistles. They're add-ons, secondary characteristics. For that color television, it would be, does it have an automatic tuner? For the automobile, does it have an AM/FM radio? For the fancy French restaurant, are the tablecloths and napkins made of linen? These are secondary characteristics, things that are added to the basic product to spice them up. But in many cases, everything else being equal, for many customers, the more features, the higher the quality. The third dimension of quality is reliability. Reliability is some measure of the frequency with which a product fails. If you have a color television, how long before the tube goes down? For an automobile, how often does it end up in the repair shop? The fourth dimension of quality is conformance. Conformance is some measure of a match with specifications or with pre-established standards. If somebody is trying to purchase a part whose measure is supposed to be 1 inch plus or minus 1/10 of an inch, does the part that you buy actually fall within those limits? Or do you find a number of parts that actually measure 1.5 inches? The fifth dimension of quality is durability, or product life. The easiest way to visualize this is with a light bulb. You buy a light bulb, plug it in, and after a certain number of hours of use, the filament burns up, and the bulb has to be replaced. There's a clear and unmistakable measure of how many hours of use. The sixth dimension of quality is serviceability, or the speed, courtesy, and competence of repair. Here, it's important to understand that customers care not only about the frequency with which a product fails, but also how easy it is to bring it back up to performance. The seventh and eighth dimensions of quality are the ones that are most subjective. The seventh dimension of quality is aesthetics. Aesthetics are fits and finishes, the look, the feel, the sound, the taste, the smell of the product. And here there's a good deal of variation among customers. The eighth dimension of quality is perceived quality, or reputation. Here what it's important to recognize is that there is a halo effect, an effect that goes in both directions. If people have had bad experiences with your product or service, they're likely to attach those feelings toward any new offerings. So what you've got here now is 8 dimensions, a disaggregated framework, a way of talking about quality in a more precise fashion. But it's important to recognize that in addition to a good vocabulary, these 8 dimensions underline a very important point. You can compete on quality in more than one way. There is no single uniform quality strategy. You can in fact single out particular dimensions of quality and use those as the basis for competition. Perhaps the best way to illustrate this is the auto industry. Back in 1980, Fortune magazine did an article looking at Japanese cars. One of the things that they found was that during that period, Japanese cars were renowned for their fits and finishes, their aesthetics. The doors would slam and fit tightly, the paint jobs would be flawless, and also for their reliability. The cars simply didn't break. They had a much lower incidence of warranty claims. But what Fortune also found was that during that period, Japanese cars didn't do very well technically. And yet if you went out and back then asked people what would be a high-quality automobile, frequently the answer came back, Toyota and Honda. Why? Because if you also went out and did the independent market research and asked people what's the single most desired quality characteristic in a car, the answer came back unambiguously, reliability. What the Japanese had done was pick that niche, that dimension of quality, which was most important to customers, and they'd gone after it. There was a perfect match between what customers were looking for in terms of desired quality characteristics and what the Japanese were offering them. These dimensions also give you one other advantage. They enable you to avoid quality errors. All too often, companies think they understand what customers mean when they're looking for a high-quality product, when in fact they're picking out the wrong dimensions on which to compete. Here a good example comes from the telephone industry. When telephones were first deregulated, a number of companies came out and introduced fancy sets with lots and lots of features. Turns out that those sets sold poorly because what customers were really looking for when they were saying, we want high-quality telephones, were simple, durable, long-lived sets. A number of the telephone companies made this mistake. They soon recognized that their market research simply wasn't precise enough to pinpoint what it was customers meant when they were looking for high-quality telephones. So the additional advantage of having these 8 dimensions is we can single out what it is the customers want and avoid those errors of going after the wrong dimensions of quality. Now that we've disaggregated quality into its separate components, let's see how this approach might be used. How do you go about applying a disaggregated notion of quality and use it to drive competitive positioning and the subsequent projects that might fall out from that? A good place to start is L.L. Bean, a mail-order catalog company as well as a retail store that's long been renowned for high-quality service. In fact, they have a motto. At L.L. Bean, the only boss is the customer. To make that strategy come alive, they've developed something called the BEST strategy, which is an attempt to be quantifiably, measurably the best in 3 areas: products, services, and communications, by which they mean the catalog and the copy that accompanies it. What they've developed is a series of customer utility matrices, which are efforts to disaggregate what the customer is looking for in each of those 3 areas, and then to assess themselves relative to competitors on each of those narrow attributes. That's clearly a disaggregated notion of quality, although they do use different terminology than the 8 dimensions that I gave you a few minutes ago. To hear how this approach works at L.L. Bean, I spoke with Bob Peixoto, the Director of Planning.
We've developed customer utility matrices that look at the world of the customer as we see it, and we think when a customer looks at a mail order company, he can see our products, our communications being our advertising, our catalog, and our services, our customer service. So we've developed a matrix in which to measure our success at satisfying the customer in each of those 3 areas. What we do is we measure our performance versus our competitors' performance along each of the attributes that we feel are important factors in their purchase decision.
So if it was a customer service matrix, what would be some of those attributes?
Down the side, we might have guarantee, the strength of the guarantee that the company has and the degree to which they stand behind it. In-stock position, when you call up an order from the company, will we have the item in stock for us to send out to you? The quality of the phone help, order shipping costs. There's about 10 items that go down the side of that particular matrix.
How do you go about assessing where Bean stands relative to those chief competitors on any one of those attributes?
Let's take the service matrix, for example. We shop from ourselves and from our competitors an average of 35 times a year for 75 items. And as soon as we call up the customer, we're measuring how long it takes them to pick up the telephone. Then we measure how well we're treated on the phone, determine whether or not the item's in stock. That helps us measure the in-stock level. Then we can measure how long it takes them to get the item to us. Then sometimes we actually beat the product up and send it back and see how well they stand behind the guarantee. We do this to ourselves, too. It's an independent group, so we try to keep subjectiveness from coming into it to the degree possible.
So in many ways, you serve as customers when you go out and you test exactly what the competitors are doing.
We are very good customers of ourselves and of our competition. We purchase, as I say, about 35 times a year from each competitor.
Let's recap what we just heard. First, L.L. Bean clearly uses a disaggregated approach to quality. They try to break down in each of those 3 core areas, products, services, and communications, exactly what the customer is interested in. Second, once they have that disaggregated notion of quality, what quality really means to the customer, they go out and compare themselves against competitors. And third, and perhaps most important, they've taken the perspective that the only way to understand the customer's point of view is to develop an internal group at L.L. Bean itself which operates as a customer. These are people who purchase directly, call up and make orders, not only from competitors, but from Bean as well. That's clearly a way of getting the customer's point of view internalized in the organization. Now, what we saw at Bean was the use of a disaggregated concept of quality, but one that didn't use the 8 dimensions explicitly. For our second example, let's turn to Baxter Healthcare, where these 8 dimensions are being used, and exactly the same terminology is being employed. Baxter, for a number of years, has had a quality leadership process, which is very much in the spirit of quality control and quality assurance. It's only in recent years that they moved to a more strategic perspective. And to do that, they initiated an experiment at Bentley Laboratories, one of Baxter's divisions. Bentley is a division that manufactures membrane oxygenators, which are used in open heart surgery. To initiate the process, what they did at Bentley was to conduct an internal survey, to look at the internal customer and to see how quality was being defined or what the internal perception was of how customers were defining the final product. To understand better how this internal market research was conducted, I spoke with Vito Majorano, who is an area manager in Baxter's quality leadership process?
We wanted to talk to senior managers because of the belief that whatever the senior managers are thinking about quality, whatever they perceive that the market is going to respond to in terms of quality, that forms their quality strategy. Stated or unstated, formal, informal, it doesn't matter. They have a quality strategy. They're moving the company in some direction based on how they think the market is perceiving them and how their products perceived, how their services are perceived. So they had some quality strategy already. What we wanted to do was try to clarify that, see if the 8 dimensions would be a good framework for articulating what was probably previously an unstated quality strategy. And then when we go to the market, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, in a second, when we go to the market, we have a place that we can compare their quality strategy with what the customers are actually thinking.
What kind of questions did you ask?
First of all, I should make clear that most of the questions we asked them to respond as they thought their customers would. And we asked them, when your customers talk about quality, what are they talking about? And what we tried to do is naturally evoke some of the 8 dimensions, and that happened very easily. They said, well, they're talking about reliability. They're talking about, is the product made right? And then we would say, soil conformance type of quality. That happened very naturally. We got halfway down and would easily evoke about 2/3 of the dimensions in most of these interviews.
Now, you also used a 100-point scale to somehow get people to tell us what exactly were the customer's chief priorities when it came to quality. Could you tell us a little bit about how that was used?
Yes, what we did was ask them to give us the relative importance of those 8 dimensions as they thought their customers would respond. Which of those 8 dimensions do you think the customer most highly values when they're making quality perceptions? Which next? Given 100 points, how would you break them among these 8 dimensions? So we got them to give us what you might call a quality profile of the membrane oxygenator market.
You also seem to have broken it up by functional groups, where these people were in the organization.
We took all of the respondents in the finance area and other. Finance and other formed one category. We put sales and marketing in a second. We put manufacturing and QA in a third, and we put the R&D respondents in a fourth. And now we're talking about very small samples, about 5 or 6 at the most in each of these categories. But even so, there were some dramatic differences between the sales and marketing responses and the R&D responses. This clearly told us that we weren't unified in our understanding of the customer, that whatever profile we had created of the customer was different in different parts of the company, and if it's that different, it obviously can't be right. Somebody's got to be wrong.
Radically different weights were being applied by the different groups to each of the different dimensions of quality. What this pointed out was a clear need for more external market research, more market research focused directly on the customer. And that was conducted in 2 phases. First, qualitative research, to understand a little bit better what distinct attributes were going into each of the 8 dimensions. And second, more formal quantitative research to actually get at the relative priorities and weights that customers were applying to each of the 8 dimensions. That research is still ongoing, and the results are only now coming in. But already, as you'll hear from Tony Brown, the president of Bentley Laboratories, they've had an impact on the company.
There was a little surprise in the comparison of the data of where internally we thought of features of products being a little higher than durability and reliability than what our customers thought. But if you really stop to think about it and you really focus from a customer point of view and you spend time with them watching them perform the duties and services they perform, you realize how critical it is to really have durability and reliability in the product. We see that they're under a lot of stress as a person's chest is open and they're performing this surgery, or the cardiac surgeon is standing there wanting to have absolute conformance to their requirements. We see how critical it is to have reliability and durability built into the product so it works exactly the same every time. In other words, no surprises during the medical procedure. The results of our study of the dimensions of quality will have a significant impact on the strategy or strategic direction of Bentley as we move forward. As we develop products, we'll put into the design requirements much more emphasis on reliability and durability. We'll put more emphasis in the manufacturing processes and in the test we run to make sure that each unit operates the same as the unit before, that there's good consistency from unit to unit.
Let's turn now to the second defining characteristic of the strategic approach to quality. The fact that quality is linked with profitability on both the market and the cost sides. If you think back for a moment to the earlier eras, quality control and quality assurance, the only linkage that we heard about was that quality was linked with profitability on the cost side. That in itself, though, is an important mechanism to understand. The idea here is relatively simple. If, in fact, you can prevent problems from happening, if you can invest more in education, in training, in working with suppliers, in reducing defects before the fact, or catching problems earlier in the chain, what you will see is that you will get lower manufacturing costs because you'll have higher productivity. And in general, you'll be doing things right the first time. You won't be correcting errors after the fact and incurring large reject, rework, and scrap costs. At the same time, you'll have lower service costs. You won't have warranty expenses. You won't have liability costs, which can often be enormous. Now, as long as the costs of prevention are less than the costs of correcting these problems after the fact, this is very much in the spirit of Joe Duran's gold in the mine, we'll find that higher quality will lead to higher profitability. And in fact, as you can see by the graphic on the screen right now, those savings can often be enormous. What you're looking at now is some work that was done at General Electric, where they found that the cost of finding a defect rose each time you worked your way closer and closer to the customer, and further away from the point of origin in the development or manufacture of a product. At the initial stage, the component stage, the cost of finding a defect was 0.003 of a cent. At the final stage, in the field, the cost was $300. The difference between finding that defect at the beginning and at the end of the process is a factor of 100,000. What you're seeing then is that there are enormous savings that can come from finding defects earlier in the process, preventing problems from happening later on. The second linkage between profitability and quality comes on the market side. Here what you do is you improve the quality of the product or service you're offering, get an improved reputation for quality in the market, either through advertising or word of mouth, then either sell more at existing prices because you have a higher quality product, or increase your margins, become the premium producer, and that way get higher contribution. Either choice you make, as long as the costs of improving quality in the first place are less than the benefits you get in terms of increased contribution margin, you're going to increase your profits. So the second measure here, the second mechanism for linking quality with profitability, is the market side. What's important, though, and the distinction here with the earlier eras of quality, is that in the strategic approach, quality is linked with profitability on both the market and the cost sides. In this context, it's important to revisit the two companies we spoke with earlier, LL Bean and Baxter Healthcare. Because in each case, they had quality linked with profitability through one of these mechanisms, but not through the other. And that, in fact, is what stimulated them to introduce a quality program, a total quality or a strategic quality process in the first place. First, we'll go back to LL Bean. Their sales were going up at a radical rate. But what was missing was the second linkage between quality and productivity. They simply weren't doing things right the first time. They were missing the quality control and quality assurance pieces. And in fact, there's an important point here. To get a fully integrated strategic approach to quality, you need to have pieces of the earlier eras as well, because they build up in concentric circles. Each era includes pieces of the one that preceded it, but then goes a step further to add additional elements. At Baxter Healthcare, the problem was slightly different. They had gone through several years of what they call a quality leadership process, which was firmly anchored in the quality control and quality assurance periods. What was missing was the strategic approach. And that, in fact, is what induced them to go a step forward at Bentley Laboratories. At Bean, they already had a customer perspective. What they were missing was quality control and quality assurance. At Baxter, what they had was quality control and quality assurance. They hadn't yet pushed outward toward the customer. What this emphasizes is the need in the strategic approach to be all-inclusive, to have QC, QA, and a customer-oriented point of view. That's why we say that the second defining characteristic of the strategic approach is that quality is linked with profitability on both the market and the cost sides. In the next segment, we'll be turning to two additional defining characteristics of the strategic approach. First, quality is used as a competitive weapon. And second, quality is linked with the strategic planning process.
Segment 3, Quality and the Competition.
The third defining characteristic of the strategic approach is that quality is viewed as a competitive weapon. Now, that in itself has several requirements. The first is that you try to exceed rather than match competitors' quality. And there's an important hidden assumption here. The assumption is that you know what your competitor's quality actually is. Building on that, you then go ahead and you pursue a strategy of continuous improvement. You never stop. You're always moving ahead on the quality front. And the reason is that if your competitors are also viewing quality as a competitive weapon, they're constantly going to be striving to improve. Think back to the three eras: inspection, quality control, and quality assurance. Where were competitors? They simply didn't appear. The reason was that quality was being pursued for internal reasons, to eliminate problems, to reduce defects, rather than for competitive purposes, positioning yourselves in the eyes of the customer and offering products and services that were superior to those of competitors. How do you do this? How do you go ahead and use quality as a competitive weapon? Well, a company that has moved very far forward in this regard is Xerox. Xerox has actually gone ahead and developed a technique which they call benchmarking. Let me first describe it to you. In order to do that, I'd like to read to you some quotations from Robert Camp. Camp was a member of the logistics group at Xerox that did some of the earliest benchmarking studies. And he starts out and he says, benchmarking is the search for industry best practices that will lead to superior performance. Those best practices are to be pursued regardless of where they exist, in one's own company, industry, or outside one's industry. And in fact, there's an important message there. A number of companies do what we might call internal benchmarking. They compare their very best plants to other plants in the system. They compare the very best service operations to their own best service operations. Other companies go a step further, pursuing what you might call competitive benchmarking. They try to contrast their practices with those of direct competitors. But relatively few companies go that further and final step, looking at whoever happens to be best in class, even if it's not a direct competitor. Now, the second element to benchmarking, according to Camp, is that benchmarking can be applied to all facets of a business: the basic products and services, the processes that go into manufacturing those products, and the methods that support getting those products and services effectively to customers and meeting their needs. In fact, when Xerox started out, all they did was benchmarking of products. They took, for example, copying machines that were made by direct Japanese competitors and used reverse engineering. They tore them apart to find out why those products were so much better in terms of reliability and also so much cheaper in terms of cost. Now, Xerox actually does benchmarking of particular practices and processes. To use a simple example, when they try to find out what the best billing process is, they go out and compare themselves to American Express. And finally, Camp goes on to say, in the formal sense, benchmarking is an ongoing investigation and learning experience that ensures that best industry practices are uncovered, analyzed, adopted, and implemented. That's really what benchmarking is all about. It's a way of learning, as well as a way of setting goals and targets for yourself. Now, as I said, many companies practice internal benchmarking, and a few even do competitive benchmarking. But relatively few companies go that final step, the step where you get the greatest learning, and compare themselves to whoever happens to be best in class. At Xerox, they tend to call this functional benchmarking, because what it is if you're, for example, a logistics or a distribution person, you go out and you find the very best logistics and distribution group in the world, whatever the business. Let's hear what the Director of Quality at Xerox, John Kelsch, has to say about benchmarking.
The advantage, of course, of a functional benchmark, a non-direct competitor, is that they're obviously even more free to come up with new ideas. But the real advantage, I think, comes when you get outside your industry. People will tend to do things very differently. So, for instance, if you want to look at how somebody is processing an order, if you look at American Hospital Supply or somebody that does it in a totally different way, you get new ideas and thoughts. You can't copy what they do because your industry is different and your customers are different. But you can get some very valuable ideas that will help you streamline. So we say you have to learn how to adapt, not to copy what you see.
How do you choose who to benchmark against?
Okay. First, we obviously talked about direct competitors. And I'm going to use an example in workstation manufacturing. This was a benchmarking study that was done where we wanted to look at how much automation, how much investment we should be making in our manufacturing plants. And this is primarily in low-volume products like typewriters, smaller copiers, and so on. So how far do you go? Because obviously it's critical that you keep your manufacturing costs low. And so we went out and did a study of a number of kinds of companies like AT&T, like IBM, like Hewlett-Packard, DEC, and so on, and tried to find out through a number of sources, magazine articles, and also, by the way, through their salesmen who sell products to us, who really is first class in manufacturing. We've heard a lot about IBM's Lexington typewriter plant, heard a lot about IBM's Boca Raton personal computer plant. Hewlett-Packard is very well known for their terminals that they have out in California and so on. So they went through a very formal process, criteria, because we can't visit them all, and said, which ones do we think are the best? And they had some rating schemes and so on and so forth, and came up with that. So it's sort of a discipline process on direct competitors. On who's a functional leader is much more difficult. Then we always tell everybody, use the library. People who are good at something write articles. And it is amazing what a library search will do to find out who's got something that's worthwhile looking into.
How do you confirm when you found the company that's best in class?
Well, of course, you have to visit, keep looking. And remember that best in class is, when you're looking at functional benchmarking in particular, is very difficult really to determine. What you're looking for is primarily the best practices. Now, let me give you a specific example in billing. The office equipment industry is a difficult kind of environment, and so when we look at IBM and AT&T and ourselves and Kodak and so on, we all have a fair amount of difficulty in billing our equipment. But when we try to find out who's the best in the industry in terms of their billing error rates and so on, but we look to American Express as a world-class benchmark. And even in American Express, you have to recognize that their billing rates vary around the country and so around the world. And so one of the things that we found with American Express is their Japanese company probably has about the lowest billing error rate in all of American Express. They become the world-class benchmark. It's probably very likely that as long as we're billing office equipment, we will never actually reach their level of billing errors, volume risk differences, and various other kinds of things. But the critical thing is, what can we find out from them? If they're the world-class benchmark, what are they doing that we can learn from that will help us improve? Because that's fundamentally our goal, to be the leader in our industry and to continuously improve.
Now, there's an interesting irony here. What Kelch has pointed out is that in order to become the best in the industry, in order to use quality as a competitive weapon and to exceed rather than match direct competitors' quality, they go out and they assess people who aren't direct competitors. They go out and they talk to people who are the best, whatever the industry that they're located in. But how exactly do you do this? We talked a little bit about why benchmarking is important. Precisely what do you need to do to carry out a benchmarking study, to compare yourself to an organization that's best in class?
First off, you really have to study your own operation thoroughly. There's two reasons for that. The first, and probably the most fundamental, is what you think is going on is not what's actually going on. But it's important for you to then understand what your performance measures are, how they are measured, and then what practices you use in what work process you're using to deliver those. Now, the reason for that preparation, in addition to knowing what you're actually doing versus what you think they're doing, is when you go to visit the company, you need to prepare them for your visit. You're going to get maximum leverage out of that. So you prepare a list of questions which you send to them, okay, so they can prepare. And by the way, all of this is on a quid pro quo basis. You have to be willing to share your information on that subject, and then they will be willing to share with you. And that immediately protects against the thing that a lot of people ask about, and that is, how do you protect against asking about confidential information? And our rule of thumb is very simple. Don't ask for anything that you're not prepared to give. And I really believe that probably handles about 95% of the cases.
Okay, now, when you're compiling this list of questions, is the primary focus on measures and results, or is the primary focus on practices, which you say is about 90% of the learning?
Right, no, it's clearly the primary focus is on practices. As I said, you laid out these, what I call first-level questions, but you also prepared the second and the third. The next thing you do is you make sure that you've got the operational manager who's responsible for that area that you're going to benchmark along with you to see for himself what the competitor or the best functional person is doing. Because what happens if you don't take him along, as you come back with the data and you describe it all, and there's a tendency to say, I don't believe it, you got it wrong. If you take the guy who's operationally responsible right along with you, he comes back, he says, God, yeah, you ought to see what they're doing. And he's all very enthusiastic, and it really breaks down some of those barriers.
Okay. Once you're actually at the company, when you're conducting this benchmarking exercise, how do you usually spend the day?
Well, it's going to vary. Usually most companies will give you some kind of an overview, sitting in a conference room or something like that. And then oftentimes you will go to visit whatever kind of an operation is that you're seeing. And the advantage, again, of having prepared properly, giving him your first level questions, is that as you start to pursue the second level questions or the answers that you got to the first level, you've gotten good clues, and you may pick up something that you just did not anticipate. Here's a whole new thought and say, geez, we aren't doing that. And then you begin to zero in on that particular thing. Or you may be walking through a plant or a warehouse, and you'll see an operation that's something totally different, and you'll start asking about it. Because we don't do it that way. And then you begin a dialogue. And that's where you really get the value out of it.
So a big part of the planning process is planning for the unexpected.
Exactly.
Okay. How do you assimilate these results? You finished the site visit. How do you put them together in a coherent fashion?
Well, of course, obviously you go back with the people on the visit and you prepare a trip report. And the key to it is, of course, you don't visit one company. You're going to be visiting 4, maybe 6. And so you put down that key information each time you go visit, and then you come back and you kind of summarize it and do the comparisons. And what did I see differently? And remember, it's not just in the performance numbers, but it's those practices. What did they do differently? And that's, I think, one of the critical things. That's what we keep saying. 90% of the value comes from the practices and only 10% from the numbers.
So the process of continuous improvement at heart is something that requires an understanding of how goals are to be accomplished as well as a setting of those specific performance goals. In combination, the two of those, practices and precise numerical goals, are an important lever if you intend to use quality as a competitive weapon. To do that, you need to integrate quality into the strategic planning process. The fourth defining characteristic of the strategic approach to quality is that quality is built into the planning process. Now, there are a variety of ways to do this. For companies who are just starting out, frequently the best approach is to develop a separate quality plan, a booklet which stands apart from the existing business plan. For companies who are a bit further along, you can actually integrate a separate quality section into the business plan. So just as you set marketing goals and financial goals, you similarly set quality goals. And finally, for companies who are furthest along, who are truly using quality as one of their basic strategies, there's no need for a separate section at all, because what quality is the basic way of doing business for the company. Here again, Xerox provides a telling example. Recently, Xerox Canada undertook a number of studies, first to find out what customers wanted from them in terms of service. Second, to find out where they stood relative to competitors on those critical aspects of service. And third, they took the innovative step at looking at and actually mapping out their own internal service delivery process. They call it a service blueprint.
I discovered down at a conference last year a process called service systems blueprinting, which is a process of laying out your service delivery process, what we've come to term moment of truth at a time, all the little ingredients that go into the overall service delivery. And we blueprinted our service delivery, and then we were able to see exactly what it was that we did, which then set the stage with all the other pieces of information to allow us to look at the changes that we actually want to make. The blueprinting process really works at two levels. At the very simple level, it's a flow chart of how you deliver a service or how you might make a sale or how you deliver a product going from the beginning to the end. And what it does is it shows interfaces between the company and the customer, and it identifies fail points, which are areas where something might go wrong. And the key ones are the ones that the customer can see. So it's very, very important. You now have the information on your competitors, which is the first thing. You now know what they do, so you know how to be better. You know what your customers require from you, okay? And the third thing that you now have is you now have a process capability, if you like, which is what blueprinting really is, to look at what it is you do deliver, and now it becomes a conduit for change that you can actually change on paper and change it strategically before you actually go out and try to implement that in the field.
Now let's see how Xerox Canada actually uses the information they've collected to set specific service and operational goals. What you'll be seeing is Jack Poulton meeting with two senior managers as they discuss the results that have come out both of the service blueprint and of their competitive and customer analysis.
Based on all the data that we have, certainly from the customer study and the work that was done on the blueprinting, it's really, really obvious that one of the key things our customers want is they need to know when we're going to be there. That's one of their prime requirements. And what they would specifically like to have based on what our data tells us is they'd like to know when they call in, when the service rep is going to be there. And if we look through the blueprint, we can see, looking through here, that there's several places in here where in fact the customer is requesting information from us, and we have a process right now of service rep call ahead that doesn't work all the time. So, I guess strategically looking at it, we need to have a process to let the customer know when we're going to be there, and that in fact we do have we are in possession of their call and are going to look after them.
One of the questions, though, that this blueprint absolutely asks is, on this line of interaction, you have direct interaction with the customer at the point in time that the customer places a service call. Mm-hmm. And what this tells us is that we need to develop an ETA program and process to move these lines of, or these points of interaction with the customer below the line or below the line of visibility if possible. The phone ahead and the call ahead program will absolutely alleviate some of the need in here, but I'm not sure that it's going to get rid of it totally. So I think the first step is to do what we've done and move that forward.
One of the issues that came out of the calling ahead when I chatted with customers, and also when we did the blueprinting, was this whole feeling, and if you see it here on the blueprint, it's all this process of negotiation that we go through that the customer intensely dislikes. So I think I would agree with you. I think that ultimately, strategically, like 2 or 3 years down the road, would be to actually have all of that below the line so that that all happens in here and all the customer is left with is the time of arrival.
Right.
What we've seen at Xerox Canada and what the third and fourth elements of the strategic approach add up to is the need to combine several assessments. First, you need to understand the customer's desires. Second, you need to understand where you are relative to competitors. Then you've identified some gaps. You know what you need to do if you're going to exceed rather than simply matching what the competitors are offering. To do that, you need to set specific goals, and that can only be accomplished if you have an understanding of your own internal processes. That's where the service blueprint came in, and that's why companies need to look at exactly how they're delivering the goods and services they produce in the first place. You put these together, and what you've got is a comprehensive approach for using quality as a competitive weapon. In the next segment, we'll be moving on to look at the people issues, the fact that quality requires an organization-wide commitment if it's to succeed. We'll begin by looking at top managers, chief executive officers, chief operating officers, and the role they play in guiding the organization. And then we'll also look at quality professionals and the new role that's emerged for what you might call the vice president or facilitator of the quality movement.